Hello, everybody. All right, let's do this again. Today, I'm going to talk about something that is somewhat self-incriminating because I make YouTube tutorials and I get that some of them are just not very helpful. Now, not for the reasons that I think I've done a bad job, but for a completely different reason. We live in a pretty amazing time. I mean, I would like to think that so many of my skills from the last decade or so as a filmmaker, as a content creator, as a photographer, have come from internet tutorials or online courses that I've taken. I know that certainly when it comes to post-production stuff, like editing, color grading, Photoshop, all of that, I've learned an immense amount. And I couldn't really have learned it any other way other than paying for an actual course. So the amount of tutorial content that exists right now is overwhelming. Having this wealth at our fingers has been incredibly helpful as well, because when I have a technical problem that I can't solve, whether it has to do with my art or my industry or not, just building something at home and I'm like, oh, how do you do that? Or how do you fix this on my car? Well, there's a YouTube tutorial for it. But there is this sort of nagging problem that exists when it comes to tutorials. And I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but it's sort of like, why don't they work? Sometimes it feels like I've watched a lot of them and they've not really helped me much. It occurred to me one day that the reason for this is the same thing that I see typically when I teach. So I've had the great fortune over the years of teaching cinematography courses for a couple of institutions here in Toronto. When somebody is trying to understand an idea, especially if they're new to the idea, that you can illustrate that idea 1,000 times. And they kind of sort of nod their head and like, yeah, I get it. But it doesn't really stay there. It's just on vacation. It's just kind of passing through and then the idea goes away. And over the years I was teaching, I was trying to figure out like, how do I teach this so that these students can really retain this information? Now, there's some great information on this already out there, and you're gonna learn this if you ever go to teacher's college, which is say one, do one, teach one. And what that means is if I talk to you like I'm talking right now, if I'm lecturing, the amount that you're gonna retain at best is like 20% of what I say. So we know that that's not a great way to learn. But we do know that if I can make you do a thing, well, you're going to retain more information. So I could show you how to hammer two boards together, right? I can just demonstrate. And you might remember how to do it once you get the boards in your hand. But then if I make you do it and we have a conversation while you do it and we're problem solving together and you run into some problems and you correct for those problems, you're going to retain that information a whole lot more. But what's even better is if then once you've retained even the most basic parts of that information, you can turn around to somebody else and you can teach that to them. Because teaching it to them is not really about them, it's about you. And once you're in a position where you can teach something, you retain the most amount of information. Okay, so then how do we apply that to the tutorials that we are watching or that we're trying to ingest? Well, the biggest problem that you have is just execution. And this is why a lot of artists aren't really afraid to reveal their secrets, because they know that, okay, I can tell you how I shot this, how I lit this, whatever, but you still gotta go out and do the work. And that is the fundamental of what I'm talking about today, is that my biggest beef with this industry, and it's to no one's fault because it's just how the system works, is this idea that you can shortcut things, that there is a hack for everything. And like even that word just makes my blood boil, because all a hack is a technique, but you're not shortcutting anything. There's no quick way. It's just this thing you can do. Is it going to be useful to you? Maybe, maybe not. But it's not a foundational skill. And foundational skills are ones that allow you to actually survey your environment at that moment and decide for yourself what elements, what skills do you want to apply in this particular situation. And I'm going to give you a great example, which is three-point lighting. I have taught three-point lighting so many times. And if you ask me how much I stick to 3-point lighting when I light my own scenes, rarely. Not to say I don't do it, I do, more so for talking head interviews, but most of the time, I'm doing some other weird variation of that. Now, when I started out as a filmmaker, was I 3-point lighting? Every single time. Because that's all I knew, that's all my brain could comprehend. And I would watch lots of lighting tutorials and think like, oh yeah, I get that, I'll do that. But then when time came to light a scene, I only went back to this foundation that I knew, which was 3-point lighting. And you could just feel how uncomfortable the lighting was. It just felt forced. And it took me a decade of already thinking that I knew what I was doing. Like, I catch that point where you think you know what you're doing, plus 10 years. And then you get to a point where you see the subtlety in things that you were told about all the way along the journey that you recognize that you might have written in a notebook somewhere or a Google Doc to remember all these things, but then they never really sunk in until you started to do them enough. The two things that are always going to be better than any single tutorial will be failure and time. To sum up this video, I want to share a quick anecdote with you that in the last several years, I've made a concerted effort to improve my ability to speak French. I grew up in a bilingual community. I took French in school, but it just never really stuck in. And I never saw the benefit of learning it well until about 15, 16 years ago, I went and I lived in France. It wasn't just living in France, it was actually having friends that were French and spending time with them and their families. I really wanted to understand what everybody was saying. I wanted to be part of their story in their lives. And I did all the things that I could do that I thought were sort of this YouTube tutorial version of it. Now, YouTube didn't really exist at this point. It sort of started to exist, but I just got books and I listened to like French music or watched French movies, and like nothing really worked. And then later on, as YouTube happened and as all these apps came out like Duolingo, I hopped on all the apps, I paid for them, I took online courses, all these things, and nothing was really working. I wasn't getting anywhere above the most basic level of being able to understand and converse in French. During the pandemic, got really frustrated by how poor my French was, and I hired a tutor. And when you hire a tutor, at least in a learning language capacity, they are going to only speak to you most of the time in the language you're trying to learn. They're going to force you to work within that language. It's immersion. It's not through reading, it wasn't through writing, and it wasn't through listening. It's the act of doing. And the act of having to physically speak did all of these incredible things that everything else I was doing was like 5%. But this act of speaking was the 95% that I needed to be able to now understand when I turn on French radio what the news is talking about. I couldn't have done that otherwise. And it's not about putting in the work, right? We all want to put in the work. None of us are lazy. If you're motivated to do something, I don't care who you are, you will put in the work. It's not about that. It's about having the patience that all of this stuff doesn't happen immediately. You can't just sit back and consume and assume that you're going to be better at what you do. When somebody buys a camera, one of my friends buys a camera and they want me to teach them about how to take good photographs. They go, teach me about the camera. I go, turn it on all auto and go and take as many photographs as you can take, because none of those settings matter. What matters is how many times you press that shutter button, how many times you have to look at a scene and ask yourself, is this a photograph even worth taking? What do I find interesting about it? And go on that journey. I want to encourage people to spend less time on YouTube and more time actually out there speaking their craft. Because it's only when you speak your craft that you start to really learn it and start to fail and feel the discomfort in failure. Then you start to go on a journey that has a forward momentum that you can't control. And that is it for today. Thank you. See you next week.